so in this last section, we're going to talk about how populations evolve. So this goes a little further than just natural selection. So let's start by talking about variation. So remember, organisms show variations. For example, different heights, different skin colors, eye colors, blood types. Some of us make enzymes that other people don't make, things like that. New variations come about by mutations. So remember, the variations have to be there. Natural selection doesn't create new traits. So we need mutations. That's part of it. In addition to that, when we reproduce sexually, remember, you've got two parents. In each parent, you're going to have meiosis happen. So you're randomly giving one of your two chromosomes, and you might be heterozygous for certain traits, right? So you might have big B and little b, but you only give big B to one child, you give little b to another. Then you have a new combination. Every time the sperm and the egg get together, you have a brand new combination. So every individual gets this very unique combination of alleles. And what makes it unique? 3 specific things. Number 1, crossing over. Remember, let me just do a little sketch to remind you of what crossing over is. This is where you might have traits that are carried on a chromosome, and those traits cross over with your homologous partner chromosome. So maybe you had big B on this chromosome and little b on this one, and they swap places. Independent assortment, meaning the idea that, remember, when you have, say, big B, little b, and then a different trait on a different chromosome, big C, little c, that it was completely random whether you gave big B with big C, big B with little b with big C, or little b with little c, and each of those, remember, becomes the sperm or the egg that then fertilizes somebody else's random sperm or egg. So you have a lot of variations that are going to be in new combinations in an offspring. And this little animation is going to show that. All right, so
a sperm fertilizes an egg, producing a zygote. The random nature of fertilization adds to the variation arising from meiosis. Each parent is capable of producing a huge variety of genetically different gametes. The number of possible combinations among their offspring is staggering. Theoretically, one human couple is capable of conceiving a number of genetically different offspring that's far greater than the number of humans who have ever lived.
All right, so that kind of gives you the idea of how you've got crossing over, you've got independent assortment, and then you've got fertilization. And technically, you could have 1 million children, and every single one of them would be different than every other one. Now, they might look similar, they may have some traits in common, but in other ways, they could be completely different from each other. Okay, moving on. So remember that even though individuals have variations and we pass on these variations, remember that a population is actually the smallest unit that can evolve. And a population, by definition, is actually a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and interbreed. So a population of cattle that are a breeding population, a population of sheep, even a population of trees in a particular forest where their pollen and eggs are getting together to make seeds, which would be the next tree. Keep it, and then there's a special name for all the genes in the population. That's called the gene pool. So the gene pool is every copy of all the alleles that exist in that population. So there's, big B and little b, and big C and little c, and all the different combinations. Every single letter in that population is the gene pool. And microevolution is basically changes in the frequencies. In other words, how common certain alleles are in the gene pool. Because maybe if a particular trait is beneficial, that allele for that trait will become more common in the next generation. So going back, we've answered this question before, but why can't an individual evolve? Because remember, you can't change your genes. You are stuck with whatever alleles you have. What can change is whether you get to pass those on or not. So an individual cannot change their genetics. You are stuck with the genetics you were born with, but natural selection and other factors would determine whether you pass those genes on. Okay, so there is a special equation called the Hardy-Weinberg formula, and it is an equation that would allow you to test to see if a population is in genetic equilibrium or not. Now, you do not have to actually use this equation in our class. in AP Bio, you do have to learn how to use the equation. Here's all I really want you to know is that their formula, you plug in basically the dominant and the recessive, how many organisms show the dominant and the recessive trait, and you calculate how common, say, like big B and little b are in a population. Here's the important part, the only part that really matters. If the population is not evolving, then the gene frequencies will remain constant. Meaning, if 25% of the population has blonde hair, and blonde hair does not make you more fit, nobody leaves, it's a large population, we'll talk about why that is. Mating is random, meaning people that have blonde hair aren't considered sexier and get to have more offspring. No mutations happen. Gene flow, nobody migrates or leaves, or nobody new comes in, and there's no natural selection. There's 5 things here. Large population, random mating, no mutations, nobody migrates in or out, and there's no natural selection for this trait that, it doesn't help you survive better or worse. Then, in the next generation, we should still see 25% of people blonde. And 100 generations later, we should still see 25% of people that are blonde. So that's what you want to know about Hardy-Weinberg. You do not have to actually use the formula and do any calculations in our class. What you do need to know is the formula says that if evolution is not happening, the frequency will stay the same. The same percentage of people or cows or plants or whatever will have that trait 100 years later. But there are 5 factors necessary, and if one of these 5 rules is broken, if the population gets small, if mating is non-random, because people maybe are more likely to mate if they're blonde, well then blonde's going to become more common, so that's going to change the frequencies. If there's a mutation and somebody appears with purple hair, that's going to change the frequencies. If several blonde people leave, or somebody comes in with black hair, that's going to change the frequencies. Or if blonde hair helps you to survive better or worse, that's going to change the frequencies. So these 5 factors are the things that basically tell us a population is evolving. They're sort of the 5 reasons a population will evolve. So it can be used to test whether evolution is happening or not. If the Hardy-Weinberg frequencies have changed generation after generation, we see that there's a change. We compare 50 years ago to today. We can say, oh, evolution is happening. I wonder why. And we could look, well, did the population get small? Is there non-random mating? Was there a mutation? Are there organisms coming in or out that are changing it? Or is there natural selection? Like, it actually gives us 5 specific things to look for. So this is an example. These are 2 lizards. I don't think they're supposed to be mating, just to throw that out there. What they're showing here is this is the actual numbers. Again, you're not actually going to have to do these calculations. Their formula, they basically say that the dominant allele is represented by P, and the recessive allele is represented by Q, and P plus Q is equal to 1. And then there's a second formula that says P squared, which would be like big B, plus 2PQ, which would be big B, little b, plus Q squared, which is little b, is also equal to 1. If the population is in equilibrium, then you should be able to predict, based on P and Q, what P squared, 2PQ, and Q squared are going to be. Again, that probably was like, woof, but don't worry about it. You're not going to actually have to do calculations. But in this population, they're just showing how they did do the calculations. They took the number of lizards that had webbed feet versus non-webbed feet, and they calculated P squared, 2PQ, and Q squared, and from that, they figured out P and Q and went from there. But here's the bottom line. In the next generation, in this particular scenario, the frequencies stayed the same in the next generation. So that would imply that it is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. But again, for purposes of our class, you will not have to use the formula. Just know that if a population is in equilibrium, meaning not evolving, it seems to be staying steady for that particular trait, that P and Q, the frequencies of the dominant and the recessive allele, will stay the same. They'll be in equilibrium. Not equal to each other necessarily, but they'll stay the same as whatever they are, generation after generation. This is useful. We do use this in things like public health. For example, there is a disease, very rare, called PKU, fetal ketonuria. It's here. There's actually a warning on Diet Coke because people with PKU cannot take in phenylalanine. They cannot process it. It actually causes brain damage. And so and it's found in aspartame, which is the sweetener that we use to sweeten a lot of artificial drinks. Anyway, about 1 in 10,000 babies are born with PKU, and because they can't break down that amino acid, they're actually tested at birth. I believe they test every baby. They prick their heel and do a little blood test, send it off to the state, and they double check because you want to know right away if somebody had it, because you wouldn't want the baby to have brain damage not realizing that they have this particular disease. So by using the formula, they can predict how common a particular disease should be in a population, and they can also see if it's becoming more common or less common. Okay, so let's talk about the things that will change a population. Now, there's actually 5. There's only 3 mentioned here. Remember, mutation was another one. And the 5th one was actually non-random mating. These are actually the 5 things that will change a population. Natural selection, one of the traits is better than the other. Genetic drift, which we're about to talk about. Gene flow, which is a fancy word for migration, organisms coming in or leaving. Mutations, which are changes in the DNA. And then non-random mating, again, if females are being picky about who they mate with, this can change things. So genetic drift is a fancy name for when particularly in a small population, the genes or the allele frequencies change sort of randomly, not because one gene is better than another. It's usually in a small population. There's 2 specific types of genetic drift, and in general, you should know, it doesn't say this, but in the notes, but genetic drift is a specific thing that happens in small populations, specifically small populations, and it's where a gene can become more common or less common. Sometimes it can disappear altogether. Imagine you had a population of only 10 people, and only 1 person had blue eyes. And just by random accident, they went outside, and that person with blue eyes got struck by lightning. Not because blue eyes was bad, it just randomly happened. Guess what? Blue eyes are now gone from that population. Now, what are the chances that's going to happen if there's 1 million people? Probably not every person with blue eyes is going to get struck by lightning. So this usually happens in small populations, that a gene just sort of randomly gets wiped out by chance or becomes more common by chance. But 2 specific examples. One is called the bottleneck effect. It's really easy to visualize. This is where there's typically a loss of genetic diversity, and it's usually a natural disaster. So imagine a terrible, terrible thing happens, some kind of awful earthquake, and only a few individuals survive. Well, basically, notice how the orange beads, none of the orange beads ended up here. It's like a bottleneck, right? And now the surviving population that's going to repopulate is not going to have orange anymore. It has nothing to do with orange being bad. It has to do with this natural disaster that wiped out almost everybody. And so now everybody that's left is almost the same. I believe they say most leopards are almost genetically identical to each other. We believe some kind of a bottleneck happened in evolution, and the surviving small populations that came back were all very genetically similar, and they've never really diverged. And then another example is called the founder effect. The founder effect is where you imagine an island, and a small group goes to the island, and one of the people has a particular trait. That trait may end up becoming very common on the island because one of the founders or originators had the trait. And so it may become more common than it is over here on the mainland. So that's called the founder effect, because the people who founded the population have it. There's some traits like that. I know polydactyly, extra fingers, is actually very common in the Pennsylvania Amish population, I believe, and because they believe one of the founders had that particular trait, and they were a very closed and small population, and so that particular trait is more common there. So the checkpoint question, how might gene flow interfere? Well, obviously, both of these rely on a closed, small population. So the founder effect, a trait is more common because this tiny group, somebody in this group has it. But if there's a lot of migration back and forth, that's going to bring new genes in, and some genes are going to leave, and that's going to stop genetic drift from happening. And the same with a bottleneck. If almost everybody in that population dies, but then several people from another island come over, that's going to prevent the founder effect or the bottleneck effect from happening.